Place your palm directly against the masonry. Do so, no individual inside the tavern will observe. Even if they glimpse, they will conclude you have consumed slightly too much, which inside this specific structure would position you within a profoundly ancient heritage. The masonry beneath your fingers feels frigid. It is frigid in midsummer. It is frigid in midwinter. It has remained precisely this chilling for 5 centuries because this fortress was not erected to keep a tavern comfortable. It was engineered to obstruct an invading English legion. It failed at that assignment completely, and, subsequently, it spent the succeeding 500 years performing this alternative duty instead. Scotland is thoroughly populated by chambers like this. Spaces erected before 1600, before the Legislative Union, before distillation was even a lawful enterprise, where you can still request an ale tonight. Furthermore, one of these locations possesses a verse inscribed upon. It's plaster and graphite, utilizing the calligraphy of the most celebrated Scotsman who ever existed. Nobody has ever been permitted to erase it. 10 chambers. We are calculating downwards. By the conclusion of this narrative, you will never trust the word modern again. Entry 10. The Beehive Inn, Grassmarket, Edinburgh. Initiate at the lowest base of the citadel. Edinburgh Castle perches upon an ancient plug of basaltic rock, and directly beneath its precipitous southern precipice, there extends a historic linear marketplace, known as the Grassmarket. Livestock was bartered here, steeds were sheltered here, and individuals were executed here publicly, systematically, for significantly over 100 years. The Covenanters Memorial at the eastern terminus of the plaza designates the perimeter of the gallows today, a solemn ring of reddish granite embedded into the cobblestones, where more than 100 Covenanters perished for their religious convictions during the late 1600s. The Beehive occupies the northern boundary of that plaza, and its declaration, the establishment's personal assertion reiterated across municipal chronicles, is that a historic hostelry has functioned upon this precise location since the 15th century. If that chronological genesis remains valid, then the Beehive was already operating before Christopher Columbus set sail, before the Gutenberg Press arrived in Scotland, before any citizen within this square had ever encountered the term Protestant, which is vital to contemplate given what the location would subsequently be utilized for. Because here is the distressing mathematics of the Grassmarket. If patrons were imbibing upon this location during the period the establishment asserts, then for successive eras, citizens stood at this threshold with an ale in hand while the scaffold performed its lethal operations a minimal distance away. Execution dates attracted massive spectacles. Spectacles become dehydrated. Nobody documented it as commercial hospitality history, but you do not require a parchment to comprehend how a tavern and a scaffold partition a public plaza. The hostelry today is comfortable in the distinctive manner ancient Caledonian taverns are comfortable. Not artificial warmth, but gathered warmth, weathered timber interiors, and a terraced beer garden situated at the rear climbing toward the volcanic crag. During the festival fringe in August, the Grassmarket transforms into one of the most boisterous sectors in Europe, and the Beehive assimilates it the way it has assimilated every other historical epoch. And that is the reality concerning this arena. It has functioned as a cattle market, an execution site, a crowded tenement district, and currently one of the most captured thoroughfares in Britain. Yet the structure on the northern flank merely persisted through every manifestation. The Grassmarket altered its purpose repeatedly, aggressively. The tavern never required pausing that momentum, a space that outlasts every objective the cosmos allocates to the roadway outside, because it is destined to introduce the comprehensive theme of this compilation. Entry 9. The Old Golf Tavern, Bruntsfield, Edinburgh. Here is a thoroughly preposterous reality to entertain you. In 1457, the Parliament of Scotland under Sovereign James II enacted a statute prohibiting golf. That is genuine. It represents one of the earliest documented historical citations to the sport anywhere on Earth, and it materialized because young Caledonian men were neglecting mandatory longbow archery instruction, the variety that was intended to repel English incursions. in order to strike a small sphere across public terrain instead. Parliament analyzed the national defense posture, analyzed the local golfers, and passed restrictive legislation. The Old Golf Tavern perches upon the perimeter of Bruntsfield Links, one of the most ancient segments of golfing turf across the globe, and the chronology the establishment displays. Its own assertion, painted conspicuously upon the exterior, is 1456, precisely 12 months prior to the state prohibition, which signifies, if you accept the tavern at its declaration, this establishment open to accommodate a pastime that was destined to become criminalized and simply persisted regardless. Academics have not authenticated that 1456 chronology. The architecture you observe currently is significantly modern, and similar to most legendary tavern assertions in Scotland, the administrative documentation is thinner than the exterior paint. So classify it transparently. This is the establishment's assertion, not a verified historical chronicle. However, the terrain it occupies is not subject to debate. Bruntsfield Links has been contested over for generations. The short hole layout remains present, still complimentary, still accessible, and you can still observe participants navigate it from the tavern casements with a beverage in your grasp. The establishment embraces its historical legacy without hesitation. Golfing artifacts decorate the walls, featuring the sort of verdant vista out the forward window that most municipal taverns would commit offenses to acquire. And according to municipal folklore, legendary Tom Morris himself, the patriarch of the contemporary sport, the icon from St. Andrews, consumed a beverage here. Interpret that as the cultural mythology it represents, but it is exceptionally effortless mythology to credit while positioned at that casement, because the links outside appear almost precisely identical to the entity they have always represented. Turf, stratosphere, and an individual silently losing their composure over a 24-inch putt. This specific chronicle is the serene one, appreciated. The compilation turns darker from this juncture, and it does not truly brighten again until a gentleman enters a mountainous Highland tavern possessing a graphite utensil. Entry 8, the Clocken Inn, Drimmen. Now for a historical conundrum, and it represents a uniquely Caledonian conundrum. The Clocken Inn occupies the communal village plaza in Drimmen, a modest community situated near the southwestern edge of Loch Lomond on the historical path of the West Highland Way. Its claim to distinction, documented uniformly throughout the Scottish journalistic press, is that it possesses what is reputed to be the most ancient authenticated tavern permit in Scotland, originating from 1734. Contemplate that once more, the most ancient permit in the realm dates from 1734. 1734. England, as we observe in a prior broadcast, contains taverns asserting permits from the 13th century. Scotland's oldest administrative documentation is more recent than some English beverage purveyors. And that disparity is not a disparity in consumption. It is a disparity in documenting matters, because the physical structure is older than its personal permit, and even the terminology demonstrates as much. Clocken is traditional Gaelic, and it translates roughly to a masonry structure, a designation that only conveys significance within a universe where masonry was the absolute anomaly. When most domiciles surrounding you are constructed of peat and timber, the single one composed of stone does not require a sophisticated title. It simply needs to be indicated. The title is the physical description. The physical description transformed into the tavern. The Scotsman's journalistic accounts regarding the hostelry highlight the regional conviction that beverages were being distributed here considerably before the 1734 authorization, and subsequently includes the detail that everyone recalls. According to historical folklore, the proprietress here was originally the sister of Rob Roy MacGregor, the outlaw, livestock merchant, cultural protagonist, and persistent source of frustration for the early 18th century Highlands. It is folklore. I cannot display a local parish ledger, but Drimmen sits decisively within MacGregor territory, upon terrain Rob Roy understood intimately, and the narrative has remained linked to this structure for a very extensive duration. Here is the reason the Clocken is significant to this compilation, even though its earliest authenticated chronology is the most recent we shall encounter. It validates the axiom we introduced at the commencement. In Scotland, the paperwork invariably materialized generations after the pouring. The authorities managed to implement licensing, branding, and documenting long after consumption was already an ancient customary practice. So every oldest permit within this realm is fundamentally a communication that signifies. This represents merely when they initiated tracking. Everything preceding the tracking constitutes the remainder of this presentation. Entry 7. The Tarbet Hotel, Loch Lomond. This particular location arrives possessing an academic's validation upon it, which in Scotland is scarcer than a supernatural apparition. Recall David Walker, the historic Scotland superintendent who spent his professional career graciously dismantling tavern mythologies. The gentleman whose ultimate assessment concluded that no surviving Scottish architecture provably constructed as a hostelry predates the 17th century in the identical breath, documented within the Cambridge-issued publication A History of Drinking. He recognized the absolute anomalies, the locations where more ancient origins are legitimately asserted. And the primary place identified is Tarbet on Loch Lomond, possessing a documented chronology stretching backward into the 16th century. When a most cynical investigator in the discipline identifies your location that is worth greater than 100 chronological cornerstones, Tarbet perches upon the slender neck of terrain separating Loch Lomond and Loch Long. And that specific topography is the entire justification anything materialized here at all. Tarbet in Gaelic describes precisely this. An isthmus, a location where vessels could be transported overland between two separate bodies of water. For generations, if you were traversing through the Western Highlands by vessel, by livestock route, or by foot, this geographical bottleneck was exceptionally difficult to bypass. And where voyagers cannot bypass a destination, an entrepreneur will eventually position themselves distributing a beverage to them. That is not romanticism. That is pure commercial economics containing a hearth. The hotel that occupies Tarbet currently is an imposing Victorian-era structure, presenting baronial assertiveness and a dual tour bus terminal. And I desire to be completely transparent with you. The physical fabric you can perceive is not medieval. What the documentation authenticates is the location, a hostelry operating here, accommodating the waterway traffic from the 1500s. The chamber has been reconstructed around the custom never relocated. Position yourself outside it, and you comprehend precisely why. Ben Lomond ascends across the surface. The waterway extends southward in that elongated silver expanse that has been halting voyagers mid-pace for as long as voyagers have existed. Meteorology descends the mountain glen like imperceptible drapes, and when it materializes, there exists precisely one logical reaction, and the structure behind you has been offering it since before Scotland and England partitioned sovereign. Some taverns on this compilation endured by virtue of masonry. Tarbet endured by virtue of a map. The terrain itself funnels individuals to this threshold, and no historical century has yet devised a method to alter that reality. Entry 6, the Four Marys, Linlithgow. In December 1542, within a royal palace inside the West Lothian municipality of Linlithgow, a female infant was delivered. Her royal father perished 6 days subsequently. She transformed into Mary, Queen of Scots, before she could support her personal head. And her biography transpired from that specific chamber to an execution platform in England, incorporating 3 spouses, 1 assassinated clerk, a coerced abdication, and 19 years of confinement during the progression. Directly across the causeway from that royal palace perches a tavern designated the Four Marys. And the architecture it commands, this is the specific detail, originates from approximately 1500, according to the identical Cambridge academic publication we have already utilized, which signifies the structure was standing, roof secured, masonry raised, conducting its serene, mundane transactions before Mary was born. It was present when the palace casements were illuminated for her delivery. It was present, according to conventional chronicles, when Linlithgow Palace ultimately combusted in 1746 and was never inhabited again. The palace across the causeway is a roofless shell currently, magnificent, yet a casualty of time. The unpretentious structure opposite remains heated, illuminated, and distributing dining menus. Contemplate that ironic reversal for a moment, because it represents the most defined manifestation of this entire compilation's thesis. Sovereignty constructed the palace, custom constructed the tavern. Divine which entity still possesses a hearth fire burning currently? Now for the candid disclaimer. The Four Marys was not a tavern in 1500. The academic documentation is transparent that it initiated existence as a private residence, and during the 19th century, it functioned for a duration as an apothecary enterprise. You were more inclined to purchase a medicinal tincture here than an ale. The beverage consumption materialized subsequently. What exists from before 1600 is the physical space, not the commercial authorization, and that is precisely what this presentation guaranteed you. Spaces constructed before 1600 that citizens consume beverages in currently. This represents that concept in its unadulterated format. The nomenclature at least constitutes authentic history. The Four Marys were genuine historical entities. Mary Seton, Mary Beacon, Mary Fleming, and Mary Livingston. The four young aristocratic companions selected to accommodate the infant monarch, all petitioning her given name, all dispatched alongside her to France. The tavern situated across from her nativity site carries their identities upon its signage, and inside, the walls support the historical artifacts of her biography, a 500-year-old structure preserving the archive of the individual delivered opposite. She endured 44 years. The structure opposite is navigating year 500 and progressing. History does not preserve the human beings. It preserves the chambers. Entry 5. The Tolbooth Tavern, Canongate, Edinburgh. Here is an inquiry nobody articulates while completing an order at the counter of the Tolbooth Tavern. How many citizens were confined inside this structure against their personal volition? Because this is the installment where our narrative motif ceases murmuring and commences shouting. The Tolbooth Tavern, situated on the Canongate segment of Edinburgh's historic Royal Mile, occupies a section of the historic Canongate Tollbooth. And the Canongate Tollbooth was erected in 1591. That chronology is not a tavern myth. It is engraved into the architecture's chronicle and cataloged by the preservation agencies that register it. The Tollbooth represents one of the highly identifiable landmarks of the historic Old Town, featuring its decorative turrets and its immense cantilevered timepiece suspended over the walkway. A tollbooth, if the terminology is unfamiliar to you, represented the administrative center of a Scottish burgh and its judicial fist. This specific one accommodated the Canongate, then an independent municipality situated outside Edinburgh's defensive fortifications, functioning as its municipal council hall, its courthouse, and its correctional facility. Imposts were collected here, jurisprudence of the 16th century variety was administered here, and individuals were confined here within this physical fabric behind these walls. And select individuals among them will have gazed upon the identical masonry you can currently rest your forearm against while deliberating between single malts. The commercial tavern itself is not ancient. It originates from the 1820s, as Edinburgh's personal promotional history indicates. The beverage distribution represents the modern newcomer. The chamber represents the ancient one. And of every historical transformation on this compilation, this represents the one possessing the most macabre sense of irony. A space engineered to incarcerate individuals currently cannot induce them to depart. The structure does not permit you to overlook what it previously represented. The walls are dense in the manner only municipal masonry is dense, constructed not for domestic relaxation, but for institutional dominance, for retaining capital inside, prisoners inside, and atmospheric elements outside. The casements rest profoundly within their alcoves. The timepiece outside has been communicating the hours to the cannon gate across 4 centuries of the thoroughfare below, transforming from a district of aristocratic residences to impoverished tenements, to commercial breweries, to the manicured historical destination it represents currently. Every installment thus far has focused on a space that altered its occupation. A residence transformed into a tavern, an apothecary transformed into a tavern, an isthmus sanctuary transformed into a hotel. However, this constitutes the premier chamber on the compilation that was constructed by the state for the state to manifest the state, and even that manifestation could not endure. Granted 400 years, Scotland converts everything into an environment where you can procure a beverage. Even the prison, especially the prison. Entry 4. The White Hart Inn, Grassmarket, Edinburgh. We have returned to the Grassmarket, returned beneath the Citadel Crag, and during this instance, we are venturing subterranean. The White Hart Inn at 34 Grassmarket appears from the causeway like an appealing historic Edinburgh tavern, and the visible architecture is precisely what the academic documentation asserts it is, 18th century, originating from approximately 1740. If this compilation focused on exterior facades, the White Hart would not achieve inclusion. However, the Undercroft cellars are 1516. That is not the tavern projecting assertions. That is the documented architectural chronicle. The identical Cambridge publication establishes that the White Hart constitutes one of the most ancient enduring hostelries, originating back to 1516, possessing Undercroft cellars surviving from that epoch while the architecture above was substituted, which generates the most peculiar beverage consumption experience on this compilation thus far. You descend into the White Hart, and somewhere during that descent, you traverse an imperceptible threshold out of the Georgian municipality and into the monarchy of James IV's successor, into a Scotland that had just been fractured at. Flodden 3 years prior, a Scotland where the Protestant Reformation had not transpired yet, and Edinburgh remained a Catholic capital offering supplications in Latin. The threshold is not designated. There exists no metallic marker at the precise step where 1740 transforms into 1516. You simply progress downwards, and the atmosphere alters, and the masonry turns ancient surrounding you, and the beverages persist in arriving. The tavern's personal folklore aggregates celebrated names aloft, and here we evaluate our mythologies meticulously. Robert Burns is asserted by the tavern and by Edinburgh's historical chronicles to have resided at the White Hart in 1791 during his ultimate journey to the capital city. William Wordsworth is asserted as a patron as well, and the more sinister connection, the one the supernatural excursions exploit, connects the tavern's regular patronage to the era of Burke and Hare, the executioners who bartered human remains to the medical anatomists during the 1820s and stalked their prey within the impoverished avenues of this precise district. That the homicides transpired within this sector of the municipality constitutes authenticated history. What precisely occurred inside this tavern remains oral tradition. I shall articulate it once dispassionately and abandon it within the Undercroft cellar where it rightfully belongs. Because the genuine narrative here requires no human remains. The genuine narrative is that in Scotland, antiquity conceals itself beneath the nation's surfaces. We reconstructed, reformed, incinerated, and modernized century after century. But nobody bothers to reconstruct an Undercroft cellar. Cellars are where a municipality retains its oldest reality, stabilizing the temperature, retaining the barrels, retaining the historical continuity. Edinburgh's history is not secured behind protective glass. It is situated downstairs. Entry 3. The World's End, Royal Mile, Edinburgh. In September 1513, Scotland deployed a military force into England and surrendered almost everything upon a hillside designated Flodden. The sovereign, James IV, was slain. Similarly were massive quantities of his aristocrats and combatants in what remains recollected as one of the most calamitous defeats in Scottish chronicle. That much is documented, lamented, and instructed. Edinburgh's reaction was terror manifested in stone. Persuaded the English would advance north to complete the destruction, the municipality hastily erected a defensive perimeter recognized subsequently as the Flodden Wall, enclosing the historic Old Town in masonry. The military incursion the wall was engineered for never materialized in the manner the citizens anticipated, but the fortification endured. Fragments of it remain standing currently, and you can approach and touch them. One of them possesses a tavern integrated. The World's End occupies the Royal Mile at the intersection of St. Mary Street, and it constitutes a 16th-century tavern whose physical fabric is integrated into the historic municipal fortification itself. The tavern's rear alcoves rest against the alignment of the Flodden Wall, and the municipal portal recognized as the Netherbow Port previously stood immediately adjacent. That portal represented the boundary of the cosmos for the individuals residing inside it. Beyond the Netherbow extended the independent burg of the Canongate, and subsequently everything else. If you were impoverished, you might never transition through it. The portal demanded tolls. The portal represented the absolute perimeter. So the inhabitants, utilizing the austere exactness, Edinburgh has invariably excelled in, designated this location the World's End. And when a tavern stood at that boundary, the identity was simply anticipating it. The portal itself was raised in 1764, but step outside the tavern currently and look downward. Embedded into the roadway are metallic indicators delineating precisely where the Netherbow Port stood, the termination of the cosmos mapped in metal beneath the urban traffic. This constitutes the wall from the introduction, the one your hand was positioned against, erected to obstruct an English legion. The military force never functionally arrived, and the masonry encountered alternative duties, 5 centuries of it. A national catastrophe is supporting the rear structural element of the tavern, and the majority of individuals consuming beverages there tonight will traverse past the metallic cobblestones on their path inside without ever looking downward. Here is what fascinates me regarding the World's End, and why it surpasses every destination preceding it. Every alternative chamber on this compilation altered its occupation quietly. Residence to tavern, correctional facility to tavern. This single one displays its historical shortfall openly. The wall failed to safeguard Scotland. The defeat it commemorates could not be nullified, and yet the reaction, the terrified, grieving, insubordinate reaction of a frightened municipality, is still performing an objective 500 years subsequently. It is obstructing the precipitation from citizens while they converse. There exist far worse monuments. There may not exist a superior one. Entry 2. The Kenmore Hotel, Perthshire. Depart the urban centers. Journey northward into mountainous Highland Perthshire to the destination, where Loch Tay constricts and discharges into the River Tay, Scotland's longest watercourse, at a whitewashed settlement designated Kenmore. Upon the village plaza perches the Kenmore Hotel, and its assertion displayed upon the structure, reiterated by the Architectural Preservation Registries, documented by photography, is that it constitutes Scotland's most ancient hostelry. The hotel's personal chronicle, mirrored by the tavern preservation documentation, presents the sequence precisely thus. Constructed as a drinking house in 1502, then formally recognized in 1572 when the regional proprietor, Sir Colin Campbell, authorized a tenancy lease so the hostelry could be managed, in the terminology the hotel itself maintains, as an honest house. Interpret the precision of those chronologies with the vigilance legendary tavern chronologies merit, but the 16th century Genesis represents the uniform assertion across the official records. The architecture is historically listed, and even modern travel commentators depart debating regarding which specific 12-month period of the 1500s is accurate, which communicates something regarding the chronological neighborhood this structure's age resides within. The hotel's personal chronicle includes that during the 17th century, Cromwellian troops dined here, and extraordinarily for Cromwellian troops, incinerated nothing during their departure. That constitutes the hotel's oral tradition, not a state document, so archive it appropriately, but it represents a highly Caledonian variety of satisfaction, the most predatory military force of the epoch passed through. And apparently the culinary offerings were sufficiently excellent to deliver us exemption. And subsequently, there is the plaster wall, the one I guaranteed you at the commencement. In 1787, Robert Burns journeyed through the Highlands. That excursion is authenticated history. He maintained diaries, and when he arrived at Kenmore, according to the narrative preserved by the hotel and by Scottish historic registries, he was so captivated by the vista of the Tay from the stone bridge that he composed a verse concerning it directly onto the structural plaster of the hearth breast within the establishment's taproom, in graphite. Utilizing his personal calligraphy, it remains present, secured behind protective glass currently. Within the chamber, they designate the Poet's Bar. There, you can request a measure of whiskey and decipher Burns in the absolute original. Not a reproduced publication, not a manuscript situated within a climate-controlled repository containing protective gloves and a scheduled consultation, but historic graffiti upon a tavern wall, precisely where the individual stood when he inscribed it. Sightseers lament that the protective glass renders it complicated to photograph. Excellent. Certain elements ought to be more challenging to photograph than they are to decipher. Contemplate what that plaster wall had already witnessed by the duration Burns elevated his graphite utensil. If the 16th century chronologies remain valid, the structure was over 200 years old that day. Burns, the national bard, the cultural icon, the countenance upon the currency, represented the modern sightseer, the recent arrival. The plaster wall accepted his verse the way ancient masonry accepts everything, patiently, and without requesting authorization. Scotland has expended 2 centuries erecting monuments to Burns, monolithic statues, museums, and an annual banquet consumed globally in his memory, and all along, within a settlement on Loch Tay. The most intimate Burns monument in existence has been suspended over a fireplace within a functioning taproom, in graphite, diminishing at precisely the velocity the cosmos permits. Entry 1. The Sheepshead Inn, Duddingston, Edinburgh. And so we arrive at the most ancient chronological assertion in Scotland, and appropriately for this nation, it materializes as a historical debate. Behind Arthur's Seat, the dormant volcano that ascends out of the center of Edinburgh, there exists a community designated Duddingston. It does not manifest like a segment of a metropolitan capital. It manifests like what it previously represented, a settlement adjacent to a loch, containing a medieval parish church nestled into the mountain shadow. And within that community stands the Sheepshead Inn, which is extensively characterized by the Scottish journalistic media and by the municipality's personal publications as the absolute oldest tavern of Scotland, possessing a consumption history upon this location asserted to extend backward to approximately 1360. 1360. Before the Stuart line had ascended the throne, within living recollection of the Battle of Bannockburn. If a drinking establishment genuinely functioned here, then it predates every alternative assertion within this presentation by more than a century. Now for the debate, articulated candidly because you have merited it by observing this far. The structure you can consume a beverage in currently is merely approximately 300 years old, as the journalistic reporting acknowledges, and no surviving parchment authenticates the 1360 genesis. It represents a tradition, an ancient, obstinate, frequently reiterated tradition linked to a location upon an ancient pathway circumventing the volcanic hill. The nomenclature itself arrives containing its personal folklore. The community previously traded in sheep, the narrative proceeds, and there exists a long-transmitted chronicle, folklore marketed as folklore, of a ram's head snuff container presented to the establishment by a sovereign. What remains absolute is the tavern, the nomenclature, and the centuries of individuals duplicating both. So what do we actually possess verified at the apex of this compilation? We possess a space where the asserted attendance ledger spans from Mary, Queen of Scots, asserted by folklore to have paused here while journeying between Craigmilla and Holyrood, to Queen Elizabeth II, whose excursion to the Sheephide for a culinary meal during her final years was extensively documented in the media.